Welcome, Christine.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to DVS's 45-hour training, 40 hours in training and 5 hours in practicum. As Angela mentioned, tonight is the first night. We're doing this training virtually. We have a lot of folks coming from different places, coming from work. For convenience sake, this is a training that used to be done live. These sessions used to be done live pre-COVID. And then during COVID, we moved them to virtual, which seems to increase the accessibility to them and increase opportunities for people to attend. So I know it's challenging to be in a virtual format for a few hours. Maybe some of you are like me and you were already in a virtual format for several hours today. So we appreciate and acknowledge all of that. And you have, of course, the options to take care of yourselves as you need to as we go along. We'll try to do a break in the middle, I believe, at least like a 10-minute break, but if you need something along the way, feel free. It's also up to you whether you turn your camera on, but I can tell you that for introductions, it would be really super nice to see everyone's faces, unless, if you're eating a stromboli or something. I understand that you might not want to be on camera, but we will do some introductions, and here we go, lovely faces coming on board. We'll do some introductions, so even if you turn on your camera for certain things, that would be great, but I'll also realize there are reasons why you may not. So just encouraging you to turn on your camera for a little more interaction if that's comfortable for you. So I'm the director here at DVS, and I've been here now for 5 years. In May, it'll be 5 years. And prior to that, I was in Berks County, Reading, at the program there, which is called Safe Berks and used to be called Berks Women in Crisis. So they are a domestic violence and sexual assault center. I was there as an employee for 17 years. And prior to that, I was a volunteer for about 10 years prior to that. I first got involved. Many people first get involved as volunteers or interns. I trained to be a volunteer. I did a lot of fundraising and community outreach kind of stuff. I also did the direct services training and took care of children while their moms went to support group and the shelter. So I did all kinds of things over the years, and then spent a good portion of my time in Berks County as education and community outreach person, like Angela is here for us. And then as the assistant director and the chief operating officer. So I got involved in all the services and all the different facets of the organization, which is what prepared me to come here when Bonnie Glover retired back in 2018. So that's just a little bit about me. My role here is primarily administrative. I work on grants and funding sources and program development, all that kind of stuff. We're a pretty small organization though, so we all get involved in a lot of things, including training and direct services. So, no day is the same as the previous one, unless it's a week where there are a lot of grants due, like this week, and then the days seem very similar to one another. But anyway, that's just a little bit about me. So before we do introductions, Angela, do you want me to explain why we're here? Yeah, so we're here for several different reasons. We're here to do this training because all new staff and volunteers are required to have it in order to interact with clients. And you probably, if you were on the confidentiality session last night, you probably learned about confidentiality and the fact that this training is required to be completed so that as an advocate, you're able to protect the confidentiality of the survivors that you're working with. So that's the technical reason. Our coalition, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they set the standards for us, for the work that we do, and also for this training. So the training is similar across the state, across all the counties. If you travel to another county and get involved with their domestic violence program, you'll have a similar experience in terms of training. You'll just learn all of the details also about how the program operates in their county. But this training would prepare you to volunteer or work in another county across the state if that's what you decided you wanted to do, or if you found yourself somewhere else, you'd still be able to be involved in this work as a volunteer or a staff person if you wanted to.
Yeah, so like I said in my email today, everything has a purpose. They, as Christine just mentioned, and she'll talk more about the PCADV standards, everybody has to have either a personnel file or a volunteer file. They outline what needs to be in those files. They outline the training topics. They actually, they're working on updating the live session trainings, but you can see that the online learning center is standardized. So like everything we do has a purpose. We try really hard not to make you do anything additional, because we know that we're already asking quite a bit. But as you will recall from last night, it's the PFA statute that outlines the number of hours of training, so that victims and survivors can have that confidentiality privilege with us.
That's right. So that's super, super important. There are many other reasons why we do the training. It's a piece of community outreach. We also recruit and train volunteers. Volunteers are essential to our program. I can tell you that volunteering has been very challenging since COVID. There was a long period of time where we just really could not have volunteers on our site, even though we were working on site throughout the pandemic. And it feels like at about this time, we're getting back to the point where more volunteers feel a comfort level coming on site, or a comfort level volunteering in person. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to recruit and train additional volunteers as well. Sometimes folks start off as volunteers or interns and then become staff members. It's a pretty typical pathway. But we're happy to have trained volunteers too. So, and we're grateful that you've made the investment of time for whatever reason to be here. We're grateful for that because it's a big commitment and we understand that. You probably won't be the same after this experience. That's what most people find, that not only will you learn and become aware of a lot of information that, maybe you've heard bits and pieces of it here and there or had chunks of it, but it's unique. This experience is unique. So it will sort of shift the way you see things. It might shift the way you see the world a little bit. I think the longer we do this work, the more it shifts the way we see everything. I think that's a good thing, by the way, but you have to be aware of that, and just be aware that if feelings come up for you, or memories or experiences of past trauma, that's a pretty normal experience, and that there are folks here that you can talk with about that. And it would make sense for you also to identify, as you go along, identify the people in your life who support you, and that you can debrief with and say, oh my goodness, we talked about this tonight and this was incredibly difficult. This is something we can talk about at the sessions, and something also that you'll want to find a way to debrief about afterward, including with us if you need to. We're available. This is an educational experience. However, due to the nature of the things that we're talking about, a lot of people share their personal experiences as well. That's wonderful. That informs the information. It informs the work that we do. Most people are attracted to this work, many, if not most, because of their personal experiences. So we set some, as we go along, we set some boundaries around that and some guidelines around that so that that can be done in a way that enriches the conversation, but doesn't sort of bog us down in that process or sort of go outside the parameters of what an educational program is meant to be about. So that's also true of the work that we do. So as we go along, we'll be talking about boundaries and how we share our personal information, when we do, when maybe we don't, all of those sorts of things you'll hear more about as we go along. Angela, how do we collect feedback at this point? Do you send out surveys
Yes,
afterward? So we'll encourage you to give feedback about the sessions. You're going to meet a bunch of different people, hopefully. The goal is that you'll meet as many of our staff as possible so that you won't only be hearing from a few of us, and you'll hear from staff, as you did last night if you were there, who have particular areas of focus or expertise in the work that they do. Rather than taking a lot of time working on a set of agreements, maybe we can agree on a few basic ones and see if anyone has any additional suggestions. So whenever we talk about topics that are, did you do this last night, Angela? This whole group wouldn't have been there. But whenever we talk about topics that are challenging, or where we might be sharing personal information or sharing experiences or opinions, we set a group of agreements or guidelines for our interactions. Probably most of you have done that in some setting or another. And usually a few of them off the top of my head that we agree about are confidentiality, in the sense that the personal information that's shared here stays here. Feel free to go out and talk about the things you're learning with friends or family members or people in the community, but anything specific about what a person in this training shares or any of that specific information, we all agree to keep confidential so that folks feel comfortable sharing. We practice conversational turn taking. So if we're having an open conversation, we would just ask that, you know, if you're a person like me who talks a lot and always has something to say, maybe you step back, you know, hold back a little bit so that someone who might be more reluctant to speak has a chance to contribute. So we take turns sharing information, sharing opinions, sharing thoughts. What are some of the other things that you think would be beneficial for us to agree to in order to be able to have some of these conversations? Anyone? Thoughts?
you can unmute or put them in the chat.
Yeah, sure, either way. I was just looking at a whole big long list of them in my office today from our meeting the other day. Speak respectfully to each other, from Jess. Yeah, I mean, that means a lot of different things, right? Where's Jess? Jess, do you want to elaborate on what that means?
Was stuck in the chat.
Some of that is that conversational turn taking, also respecting that people will have different opinions, and that's okay. We'll share ours respectfully with one another, listening when other people are talking. Other things people think of, that's a big category probably. Kathy says, everything sounds good to me. Thanks for acknowledging the personal nature of the training. You hit on the main points, confidentiality and taking turns. Okay. Others? Angela, others you want to share?
Jess, did you want to expand at all? Thank you for putting your camera on.
Hi.
I'm on my phone, so I got stuck in the chat window part of it.
Yeah.
Couldn't remember how to get out.
Oh, technology.
Yeah, mostly just not trying to put other people down or making them feel small about their opinions or their experience.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness. Yes. It's tough, right? Because sometimes we get caught up in it or we get passionate about something. We're a fairly small group at this point, but just keeping those things in mind, I think when we have our interactions, if any of you think of something along the way that would help you to feel more safe having these conversations, just let us know or type it in the chat and we can add it to that list. But typically we all agree, we wave or, hold our fingers up and we all agree that confidentiality is a really important one that will take all of these things into account as we interact with one another. Thumbs up is great. Thank you. Any questions about anything before we do some introductions?
I would just encourage everyone also to, we talked about it, but take care of yourself. Like, and I don't mean that just yourself, like we all have that obligation too. And if I pick up on something that I might check in with you about, it's just because I want to make sure that you have some additional support. But like just knowing that this is hard stuff and hearing people's stories can be hard, and so you, like, there's full permission to do what you need to do, to keep yourself in a good head and heart space throughout our sessions together. And to just really pay attention to, like, how it feels and how you're experiencing things.
Maybe
We'll
have a
talk more
purple
about
stress
that in our
ball.
trauma week. Yeah.
I don't know. I do. Yeah, thank you. All right, let's do some introductions then. I'm just going to ask everyone this is the part where we're going to ask you please to come on camera if you can. If not, I see in the chat some folks are having some technical difficulties, so that's fine too. Or if you can unmute, or if you can't, we'll ask you to put it in the chat. That's fine too. Oh, look, more faces. It's so great. Okay. So just your name, which we can see for the most part, where you're coming from or what brought you to this training. And then one question for you to answer just for fun. If you could pick up a new skill instantly, what would it be? If you could pick up a new skill instantly, what would you like to be able to do? So name, what brings you here, and that question, if you're willing to answer it, would be great. Ed Marie?
Hi. So I believe I like the skill. I'm only gonna answer that because I remember it freshly. I would like to be able to master like time management. Like if I could master time management, knowing like at this time I do this and this time I do that, like everything organized, that would be essential for me. My name is Ed Marie Diaz. What brought me necessarily to DVS, I'm going to be working at DVS as a resident assistant, sub-staff, I believe is. And I have personal reasons why I feel I want to give back and also learn. I'm literally here to learn as somebody on the other side, not necessarily as a victim anymore. So yeah, I'm here to learn, to grow, to like yesterday's meeting was wild to me. Like the things that I was learning, it was so drastic to me, like about for example, like child abuse and in general, what it is, to the real definition of that, or in general, like who you're allowed to talk to and not talk to. I think it's super awesome that we'll have the umbrella thing where we'll be covered, but we don't have to necessarily give information to a cop just because they're a cop. So it's pretty cool. I feel like I'm gonna learn how to network and how to talk to these people of like higher authority.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Yes.
You want to toss it to someone else, Ed Marie?
Oh, I don't know if I can see the names here, but I will say just because it stood out, Ellie Rose. Ellie Rose stood out.
Hi, my name is Ellie Rose, and I am going to volunteer for DVS. I'm going to be a volunteer counselor, and as Ed Marie said, just like wanting to grow and really learn from this experience. I am in my undergraduate for psychology right now, and I want to be a therapist in the future. So just wanting to grow in that experience of, really learning the rules and regulations, but also how to personally handle them and be respectful to everybody. Oh, a new skill that I would like to pick up. They're probably playing the drums. Always wanted to learn that.
It's great. Will you toss it to someone, Ellie Rose?
Sure. Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Sechrist. I'm going to be volunteering, and I'm here because I've previously worked as a housing counselor and shelter manager at the domestic violence organization that when I lived in New Hampshire, but took a break, went to graduate school. Now I am a city planner and work in affordable housing policy. So this is my way to get back to this topic that I was really, really passionate about, and what kind of took me, it's ironic because I was so passionate about it that I felt like I needed to come up with better solutions, which led me to grad school and out of the actual work of doing this work. So I'm coming back to it in the form of a volunteer, and I'm really excited to be here. And if I could have any skill, I think it'd be like coding or something tech related. It's not my thing. If I could just get it real quick, that'd be great. Yeah. And I will pass it to Kathy.
Got it. Hi, I'm Kathy Becker, and I live in Denver in Pennsylvania. I work in downtown Lancaster, and my background is in elementary education. That was my degree from Millersville, but I currently work mainly in the arts, and at the Fulton Theater, working with children there. So I became interested. I went to a mixer for DVS and became interested in maybe volunteering with the children and doing enrichment activities with the arts, but specifically I'd love to target them to help them with social emotional learning. So if I had a skill I could instantly be great at, it would be to really get into that more and help kids to identify their emotions, regulate them, possibly through the arts if that works for them, in other ways, whatever they want to have in their toolkit to help themselves through difficult situations and express their emotions in ways that are, safe for everyone around them and for themselves. So that's really what I want to work to learn and help out in any way I can here. And happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. You want to toss it to someone, Kathy?
Let's see. How about Melissa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Reed. I'm with the RISE team and the Teen Elect program. I moved to Pennsylvania just in the fall, and I had been with a community action agency in Michigan, where I previously came from, and I definitely wanted to be with one here in Pennsylvania and was bugging them until they hired me. Before that, I was with Head Start, but I actually moved with the teens and helping them with their parenting with the Teen Elect program. And I really enjoyed it here. As far as a skill, I would be great with my ADD if I could actually finish tasks before starting something new. So great.
That's awesome.
I'm going to pass it to Karina.
Hi, I'm Karina. I'm with I'm also with the RISE team. I am the program outcome specialist, but I also work alongside Melissa on the data piece of Teen Elect. And I'm being introduced to this because, sorry, I have kids.
It's okay.
I'm being introduced to this because there may be times that Melissa's not there and I will need to work with the moms one-on-one. And so I hope to learn a lot from this. One skill that I would like to master is crocheting. I've always wanted to learn how to do that. And I just never have.
It's great. Thanks. We had someone from the chat respond. I think her audio is compromised. My name is Kiana Brinkley. I'm a student in the social work program at Millersville University. One skill I would like to master immediately is empathy. That would be so great, right? Just I understand the importance of empathy and how far it can take one, so I would love to master it right away. I hear you on that one. It's great. Thanks, Kiana. Who has not shared? Jess, would you be willing to go and then toss it to someone else who had their hand up?
Found the unmute button. Yep. I'm Jess. I live in Lidditz. I'm looking to be a volunteer, and the thing that brought me here is I'm a foster parent, and as a foster parent, you don't often get to directly give resources to the family. You're mostly helping the child, who's usually in kind of like a state of stasis where like they don't know what's going to happen. So I was really looking for a place that you can more directly help give resources to people who are in these hard spots so that it doesn't end up at that stage if possible. And one skill, I'd love to magically just know how the legal system and all of that works, because even in foster care that can become a headache.
Yeah, for sure.
And then somebody, I can't really see all the pictures, so I have the name list, but I couldn't see people who put their hand up.
Just go ahead and call out a name.
Scott Lynn, Michelle, Victoria.
Nicole.
In
You
Did you say
said-
my name, or did she say my name?
yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. My name's Colin Schaefer. I'm a junior at Millersville, so I got an email about it, and I want to be a volunteer counselor because in the future I think I want to be a therapist or a counselor. I'm not exactly sure. So I'm hoping this like directs me to that path. And then a skill, I would say just anything about being good at math, because that's like my worst subject. So I would say anything with math.
I hear you.
And then if Michelle didn't go,
You're muted. There you
There we
go.
go.
There you go.
Hi,
Hi.
Michelle Erb. I live in Mount Joy. I am really looking to volunteer because I am looking for a hands-on way to give back to a community that took me in and allowed me to heal and grow. And I think the best way is to play that forward. There's a certain amount of understanding that comes if you've walked through situations. And I'm looking forward to doing that. Skill that I would love to master immediately if I could, there were so many already mentioned. ADHD would be a great one if I could focus and get one thing accomplished before I have 27 more projects that I'd like to do. Legal system would be great. I am a culinary student, so to be a master chef would be, you know, ideal as well. So
It's great. Thanks.
I don't know who hasn't gone.
I think Victoria, Eliza,
Victoria.
Nicole. Yeah. Hey, Victoria.
Hello.
Welcome to DVS.
Hello. So
We
my name
meet.
is Victoria. I currently work with LGH. I work at the Cancer Institute. I schedule chemos and their infusions. What brought me here was originally I went to school for social work at Millersville, and I was at DVS volunteering with the kids. So with me at the Cancer Institute, I love to help people, which brought me back to here to help people. A skill that I need to work on or that I want to learn is not to procrastinate, and work on my time management. That's what I really want to learn. But yeah.
I hear you.
Let me see, who else didn't go?
I think Nicole and Eliza.
Nicole.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nicole, and what brought me to DVS, besides personal reasons, is it just gives me an opportunity to help. So I'm looking forward to being able to be a peer counselor. And if I could master one skill, it would be Spanish as a second language. And then on to you, Miss Eliza.
Hi, I'm Eliza. I am also a social work student at Millersville. So I got an email about the training and I am just looking to expand my knowledge and my experience. One skill I would say that I could master if I could is dancing.
I'm with you on that one. I thought of dancing, if I could wake up tomorrow and be able to dance, speak Spanish. So several of them that we've been talking about. I thought, wouldn't that be great? Is that everybody?
I'll finish.
Oh yeah, of course, Angela, I'm sorry.
So I'm your volunteer coordinator, staff trainer, community outreach person. I'll help you get connected and plugged in to wherever it is that you want to be plugged in here at DVS. I've been in the field for 25 years this year. I started in college working, volunteering at the Sexual Assault Center in Lancaster, and have moved around quite a bit. Oh dear. Okay, so here's Ricky. We need to meet Zoom Kitty Ricky.
Here he is.
I'm in love.
Hey,
Oh my
Ricky.
goodness.
So during
like, "Hey,
COVID, this cat knew when I was on every single time, and he has not lost his groove. And you guys offered so many good things. I think I would want to speak another language, probably Spanish because it's practical, but I did try and learn Wolof at one point in time, and that would be pretty cool to figure that out too. So I think acquiring more languages would be a skill I would want to figure out pretty immediately.
Yeah, because it would take years, if not decades, right? Especially at this point. So did we hear from everybody? I think maybe we did. Okay. This is always just such a great part because Angela knows why many of you are here and what the background is, but I don't usually know. So for me to hear the places that you're coming from and what you'd like to do, it just makes me feel gratitude that so many people are interested in becoming involved with DVS and interested in helping survivors and their children. It truly, with the volunteering and also the internship program that we have, those are two of the ways that we can build our capacity to be able to serve survivors and their children in the community. So thank you for being here, and we're grateful for all of you. So tonight we are going to talk about some ancient history. It didn't seem so ancient when we were talking about it 20 years ago, but we're still talking about it now. So now it's starting to seem more ancient. But how did we get here? How did this movement begin in the first place? And And why do we talk about this? I mean, we could move right along, right, and start talking about some of the more practical things and the practical skills that you'll need to develop and the information. But sometimes it's important just to take a step back and say, where did this come from? Why do we do this work? Why is this work done the way that it is? What's the history of this movement, really? So the longer you've been involved, the more information you'll have about that. And of course, if you grew up in the 70s like I did, some of this is more relatable. But we'll talk a little bit about how the movement started. When did services start for victims of domestic violence? We'll just go through that history piece at a very high sort of airplane level. Most of you have probably delved into this more deeply in college courses, but again, we're just going to skim the surface and talk about a little bit about how we got here. And then we're going to talk about who we are today, how our organization is structured, just some of the basic information that you need to know about DVS before you continue with all of the other topics and presenters that you're going to talk about. So bear with us on that, and we'll get through this first session together. So I'm going to share my screen. That's the first test of the evening. Here we go. Great photograph that looks like it's probably from the 70s, which, many of you weren't born, but I was a teenager, so I remember these times. The roots of the domestic violence movement are in the roots of the women's rights movement. And also we'll find out the roots of other movements for justice, including the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, civil rights, and the movement to end slavery. They're all connected and tied together, but we'll focus a little more on the women's rights movement in this session. So the history of the movement, and again, a march that you would have seen on any street. They're still happening today. The hairstyles and everything look a little different, but we're still out there demonstrating for justice today. So PCADV and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I'll try not to use acronyms you might not be familiar with. So the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the early developers of the domestic violence movement, or at that point they called it the battered women's movement, believe that it's patriarchy, or the concept of patriarchy, that power over, that is at the roots of domestic violence in our culture. It's systemic. It's embedded in our systems and our society. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. We'll talk a little bit about that, just a quick overview. But that's basically the system that created a space where in this society, for all of its life, and coming to sort of a head in the 70s and early 80s, women were systematically controlled by some men. And that's at the root of this movement and at the root of the work that we do. So some of the work that we do, although we're helping victims and their children, is about dismantling this system of patriarchy. Now, this doesn't mean that every victim of domestic violence identifies as a woman or as a female. Men and male identified individuals can also be victims of domestic violence, but we're talking about sort of the overarching power struggle that took place, where women typically didn't have access to the same resources and the same agency that men did. And I would argue that in many ways they still don't today, even though there's been a lot of progress made. So that's at the roots of this violence and this control. It goes all the way back, way back before the United States, of course. It goes all the way back to the early societies that were on the other side of the ocean. So far back, in fact, that we're talking about Roman society and those early societies, starting off as patriarchal societies. So in approximately 202 BC, the family structure changes. So in these societies, wife beating or beating your wife was accepted and condoned under the laws of chastisement. The husband had absolute rights to physically discipline his wife. Some say that that's where the phrase "the rule of thumb" came from. The husband could beat his wife, but not with something larger than the size of the circumference of his thumb. Some dispute that now, but I'm not sure where we are with that. Angela, I don't know if you know, but it's still part of that history. This is perpetuated in English common law and throughout most of Europe. So it sets the stage for the laws, of course, that come eventually to this country. In the Middle Ages, the family structure starts to change. Some women were given more freedoms, including property rights and the right to sue their husbands for unjustified beatings. But just prior to the Middle Ages, the church fathers established the husband's patriarchal authority and the patriarchal values of Roman and Jewish law. And the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great has his wife burned alive when she is no longer of use to him. Shocking, but not absent from some of the things that continue to happen today. At that point, the church sanctions the subjugation of women. Priests advise abused wives to win their husband's goodwill through increased devotion and obedience. And some of those practices are mirrored in more modern times, when, for example, police officers used to tell perpetrators to take a walk around the block and everybody could calm down. So we can see sort of where some of these practices, attitudes, norms, and beliefs came from. At this point, were in the habit of looking upon women as a species apart from men, without the same feelings and capacity for suffering that men possessed. And this became sort of the norm or the way of thinking during the Middle Ages. And in a medieval theological manual, a man is given permission to castigate his wife and beat her for correction. So while these things sound outlandish and outdated and ancient, they are the precursor and the predecessors to what was tolerated, especially in this society in more modern times. Just more history here. We start moving into America and talking about early settlers in America, basing their laws on Old English common law. These traditions, norms, laws are passed down, were brought over here. And the English common law that explicitly permits wife beating for correctional purposes. And then are we moving forward? We start to move forward at sort of a slow pace or a glacial pace at some point. You start to see laws passed in states that address wife beating, as it was referred to at the time. 1824, the decision by the Supreme Court of Mississippi allows husband to administer only moderate chastisement in cases of emergency. Of course, no one knows how to interpret that. Oddly enough, in 1871, Alabama and Massachusetts made wife beating illegal. Didn't mean it didn't continue to happen, but there did start to be laws on the books around that time. Whether they were enforced is another conversation, of course. In 1882, Maryland passes a law making wife beating a crime, punishable by 40 lashes or a year in jail. even at this point, we rarely have jail sentences for individuals who've harmed their partners. So interesting, though, that these laws started to be passed at this time. And then by 1910, 38 states allowed divorce for extreme cruelty. And the problem was that no one really knew how to define that. And it was sort of defined in all different ways. There was a baseline of tolerance for wife beating, as it was called at the time, that if it didn't bruise or injure someone physically, it wasn't to be prohibited. And I would say to you that it's changed, but it hasn't completely changed. So, those norms and those attitudes have continued to perpetuate far beyond the time period that we're talking about here as well. So the anti-violence movement in the US, Angela, is this where do you want me to just mention these things and then we'll break apart into groups?
So no, we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna do a little group activity here. I'm sending, if you can pull up the chat, I'm gonna send you some instructions. So we've identified 6 movements or specific events like the Women's Rights Convention, the 13th Amendment, which is the abolition of slavery. You can see it in the chat. There's 6. And so what we're going to do is at this time, we're going to break you into 6 breakout rooms. So if you're new to Zoom, what will happen is when I open the rooms, you will get a black box on your screen that says you are being invited to join breakout room 1 or breakout room 2, and just click on the accept and you will magically get sucked into that room. And so what we'd like you to do is we're going to give you about 13 minutes. I know that that's kind of quick, but we all have access to our Google or our DuckDuck or whatever search engine you use. Take a look at whatever your group has been assigned to, and pull out a couple of salient points that you think apply to, either women's autonomy, or the perpetuation of violence against women, or perhaps both. And so, yeah, and just, talk with one another, get to know each other a little bit, give yourselves a quick little break. What'll also happen is once we get towards the end, is that you'll get a countdown. It'll give you a 1-minute warning before the rooms close. And then the rooms automatically close and you get sucked back into this larger room. And then when we're back here in the larger room, we'll give you a couple of minutes to share some of those salient points that you identified. But we want to hear from you and what you think is important. And we'll fill in whatever else we think is necessary. So any questions?
Will they be able to see the chat from their room?
I think I can send the message again, and
Okay.
be able to,
Okay.
get that information out to them.
You're the Zoom expert.
That's a loose term, but yes. All right, if you have any questions, I think there's also the ability to raise your hand when you're out there. So let's go ahead and give this a try. And we'll see you back here in about 13 minutes.
Now that you're talking about it, I can see what I would do with them.
Okay.
That's a good idea.
It just brings their voice into it.
Oh
a
my
little
gosh, yes. Already tired of sound of my voice.
bit.
I hate this history, this whole ancient history part too. I
I
gotta
know.
think of something else to do for this.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody really. Yeah, we keep it as short as possible. I have a cat yelling in the hallway.
Uh-oh.
He wants me to open the door.
Oh, that's right. They like to come in and visit with
Well,
you.
we don't even allow them on the second floor, basically. In the bedrooms. Couple of my family members are allergic when they,
Yeah.
it's just easier to keep them in the rest of the house.
We have some like really interesting life experiences in the group.
Yeah. I thought
That's
there'd be
pretty
more
cool.
new staff on.
I thought so too. I'm not sure. Not sure where everybody's at.
What happens during this part of the recording? Do you just stop it?
I'm gonna pause it.
All together.
Great.
Welcome back from your breakouts, everybody.
Is everybody still here? Oh, we're still waiting.
Yep, we're still here.
Are we missing a few people?
1, 2, 3.
Oh, they're there.
Okay.
So, who was in group number 1?
I was.
Amy?
And Amy.
Victoria? The Women's Rights Convention?
Yes.
What did you find out? Or what would you like to share with us about that? Or how do you think it ties into what we're talking about?
With ours, you can go ahead.
Okay. I was just gonna say we kind of talked about how the getting just rights for women and especially voting rights, and it talked about jobs and the right to own land and inherit land and rights in general. And we just kind of tied that in how it's a progression for us as women as we keep progressing in the world, and how we're talking about just the women's autonomy in general.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about how it's so focused on these rights that we very much take for granted in some ways, but in some ways we're still not quite there on in a lot of ways actually. But kind of this focus on economic rights, personhood in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of the government, but that at that time the language around like bodily autonomy or like talking about abortions is not something that's coming up in this venue or in this type of document. So we talked a little bit about that as an evolution, but also how it really is like quite a radical document in a lot of ways, like calling for shedding the government that's not actually representing you is like pretty radical and some pretty good stuff in there. So also a real lack of representation from anyone but white women and Frederick Douglass, who was also there. So.
All great points.
Yeah, we were pretty much saying how it has, changed from then to now, but we're still fighting for some rights right now.
Yeah, it feels like some rights have been rolled back, doesn't it?
Yes.
5 steps forward and 1 step back or something like that.
Correct.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Anything else for number 1? And group number 2? Who's in group number 2?
It was me and Kiana, I
yes.
believe is her name, and I give her all the credit. We were about the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. Guys, please forgive me, okay? I'm relearning everything again. But basically, how she put it, I don't know if she can talk. I don't know if- Okay, go ahead, do it. Go. Take it up.
Basically, Black women at that time who were enslaved. They were freed and they had new rights, and they gained control over like their bodies and their time. And maybe not fully, but it was a step in the right direction. It also gave women who were a part of the women's right movement, with the new anti-slavery laws and them being able to publicly speak. They were able to petition campaigns, which was all about the women's right. They were able to speak up. They were able to advocate for themselves. And while we see, like Christine said, some things being rolled back, like the Roe v. Wade and things like that, at that time it was a big thing, women being able to speak up. So that was 2 key points we found from the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for making those connections. Who had room number 3, the right to vote?
It was me and Jess.
Great.
So 15th Amendment was that men of color were given the right to vote. And we were talking about how, like, you know, men of color getting the right to vote kind of sparked the conversation of other people also getting the right to vote, like women and women of color. And we also talked about how, you know, the 15th Amendment was granted in 1869, and the 19th Amendment wasn't granted until 1920. So, you know, all of that time in between, from when men of color were granted the right to vote to when women were granted the right to vote, what was that, you know, conversation going on during that like middle period?
And I had also found it very interesting that like the Wikipedia page mentioned how like in some of like the proposals for this, they had mentioned the idea of trying to protect women's rights to vote, but it didn't end up into the final version.
Right.
Yeah, the 15th Amendment only said, you know, on account of like race and color, and didn't say anything about sex or gender.
Right. It's a great illustration of those sort of concurrent movements that were happening. I think it's also interesting to note that even though men of color were granted the right to vote in the law, you know, poll taxes, literacy tests, there were other means that kept folks from voting. And it really was almost a century later that the Voting Rights Act was passed. So, but, you know, still to mark that the passage of that amendment is an important landmark. It's interesting where it all fits in together.
I think something else that's really interesting is that we talk even today, especially with voting rights and what's happened recently in the last 5 years, like how important it is to vote, to change systems, to change government, to do all of those things. And that's really what we needed to do as women, to be, because everything was so ingrained in structure. Christine just laid all of that out for us about women and children being property and not having autonomy and all of those things. And without that voice and that vote, we were stuck for a long time.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. So who had, speaking of women's suffrage, who had group number 4?
That was
I and Melissa.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody really touched on a lot of the things that we had found as well, especially spanning 70 years of the work of so many women that were trying to get some of these rights for women to be brought forward. I think that said in 1848, it was the first convention, but in 1850, it was the first National Women's Convention. And in 1869, then the National Women's Suffrage Association was created by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So those are two of the big names that we always hear a lot with women's suffrage. But as some of the others had been saying, you know, the right for men to vote happened in 1870, and it took another 50 years for women to be able to vote until 1920. But a lot of the work that everyone did for women's suffrage, they kind of progressed alongside each other with civil rights as well. So as much as it was for, you know, trying to advance women, it was trying to advance demographics who were, you know, disproportionately, you know, put under for across the board. So they worked a lot together.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Anything anybody you'd like to add? Your partner would like to add, or are we good?
No, but you pretty much got it all. And just to add on, as far as like with the voting, we still even have a ways to go on the voting aspect, because we still cannot get a woman president no matter the cost. We still just cannot get one, just because the masses says that women are not competent to hold that office. So we still got a lot of ways to go on voting rights for women.
Hear, hear. Great, thank you. Who had the settlement house movement, number 5?
That was me in Scotland. The settlement house movement, I think if I'm finding the right information, it was started in 1889 by Jane Addams. She founded the first settlement house, and the settlement house is kind of like it was in support of immigrants, and the influx of immigrants, but also it like provided things kind of like social services now. So they I was reading as well that they did things like even classes on how to become an American citizen, which I thought that was interesting. And then it also helped change the attitude about poverty, which I feel like that we kind of have reverted back to like they don't like you're poor because it's your own fault that you're poor. So I think I found it interesting that the settlement houses help change the attitude towards the poor, and like basically how can we support you. So yeah. I don't know if Scotland wants to add anything.
No, you pretty much covered it all.
Great job. So it's kind of the precursor to social services, and also women, mostly women, getting together to ensure that families had what they needed. So I think it's a fascinating period of time to study. Thank you. And who had the civil rights movement? Kathy?
Yes.
We did.
Yeah, we did.
Kathy
So
and Michelle, great.
obviously, the first thing that popped out and that ties into women's rights as well was the mother of the modern civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, and her refusing to move on the bus in 1955. So she kind of got things rolling, so to speak. But my partner raised a really good point about, I wonder what her family and the male people in her family thought of what she did, right? And how she, how that was met back at home. I really don't know as much as I should about that, but that's a curious question from Michelle. And then there were, the thing that we noticed with all these movements, I'm sure it may have been mentioned, but just the fact that the protesting and the marching and the people physically coming together drives the legislative change. So it's just this back and forth. You could see as you go through the timeline, there'd be a big march, and then there'd be a new law passed, and then there'd be another protest or something would happen and another law passed. So like, I think that tracks along the women's rights journey as well. And let's see, just, I mean, the obvious parallel with the March on Washington and all the women's marches that have happened, especially, you know, since 2016, I guess it was the newest wave of them, I guess you would call it. And then that brought to mind the interplay of you know, race and gender. So I remember, I think I went to the one in 2019 in DC, and I feel like that was maybe the year I was hearing on the news that the leadership of the Women's March, there was some fracture within that in terms of along racial lines, I think, because I don't know, it maybe someone else with more knowledge can speak to that, but I remember hearing about that it was interesting to me that yes, we all unite on this and we agree on this, but even still within that there were these little, you know, but you know, like some, I don't want to say conflict, but just some differences of where the focus should be, I guess. I don't know. Anyone else want to comment? Feel free. Let's see. Yeah, I think someone else said that the civil rights, you know, these movements are all ongoing. So civil rights is not like it supposedly, you know, wrapped up in 68 or whatever, but it's really still, the fight is still going on. So is for women's rights. And then just popped out to us that a lot of the really well-known leaders, aside from Rosa Parks, but a lot of the people who stepped forward to lead were men. And where did that leave women in the civil rights movement? You know, were they being mentioned as much as they should? And then all the assassinations, just, was that something, I don't know as much about the history, but were there a lot of assassinations in the women's rights movement as well, or was that particular to the civil rights movement? Those are the ones that you hear about the most, I think, in history.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
Interesting question.
Anything else, Michelle?
I think we've covered it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was a lot. So this was a great exercise. So much more interesting to hear about these things from your perspectives and what you found quickly. So thank you. We appreciate that participation. Good exercise, Angela. So we're going to flip back to slides now. We're going to just go through a little bit about the history of so figure that the conversations we just had sort of leave off around 1970 or the early 70s. We're going to talk about sort of where we've gone from there. And we have a lot to cover in 35 minutes before we finish. So I don't think we'll take a formal break, but certainly if you need to take a break, you know, go ahead and take one. I'm going to just push on through a little bit if that works for everybody. And we'll get to the DVS information at the end too. We'll see if we can cover just about everything. So I will attempt to share my screen again. There we go. So where we left off in the discussions we just had was what we all agree was not the end of the civil rights movement, but culminated in the Civil Rights Act and, you know, some of the more prominent things that happened during that time. What started to happen in the early 1970s as an outgrowth of the women's movement and the civil rights movement and all of those movements for equality was that women started to also gather together and talk about the impact that it was having on their lives when they were being controlled by the men in their lives. So it's one thing to be controlled, you know, at the systemic level. We know that women didn't have the access and the rights that they deserved, but there was a whole nother large group of women who were being abused or having violence happen to them in their own homes. And when women started getting together to talk about what was their experiences, including what we still didn't have a name for then of domestic violence, they started to figure out that they were not alone, that these things were pervasive in society as a result of all of the conditions we've talked about, and that they could support one another. So a sisterhood movement or a sister helping sister, whatever we want to call a grassroots movement, formed. And, you know, if the resources weren't out there yet, then women and some men who got involved decided that they would make sure that the resources were available. So in the middle 1970s to late 1970s, one of the things that was realized was that women primarily experiencing domestic violence needed safe spaces. They needed shelters or homes where they could go. That's where the term safe home or safe house came from. They were usually private residences or folks who were willing to, churches, other places where people were willing to put themselves on the line or their organization on the line to take in a woman and her children to keep them literally safe from physical harm. It was pretty much a self-help or what we would call an empowerment model even then. There was also a realization that it could happen to anyone. It wasn't a deficiency or something about that person that made that violence happen. It was a systemic cultural construct. And, you know, when we believe that it's a problem of that magnitude and that it's being experienced by that many people and they're starting to get together and talk about it, then we start to shift our focus to providing resources and recognizing that the folks committing the violence, the perpetrators, were the problem, not the people experiencing the abuse. I would say we're still struggling with that even today, but again, it's one of those areas where we've made a lot of progress, but we still have some work to do. We've also started to recognize that the consequences of this abuse were serious and potentially long-term. It wasn't enough just to get away. There were going to be other consequences, although getting away was a start, right? So society needed to change and protect folks who were at risk. The Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence was the first state coalition to organize. Their purpose is to eliminate domestic violence, and their practical purpose is to make sure that all of the counties in Pennsylvania have shelters and other resources available for victims of domestic violence and their children. Those are not limited to women who are victims. We serve all victims of domestic violence. It's just primarily in our shelters, we serve women. Their goal is also to expose the roots of domestic violence in our culture. Those are those embedded systemic beliefs and norms that allow this violence to perpetuate. And their other purpose, thank goodness, was to provide funding, to find funding and provide it for the programs in the counties to be able to deliver direct services. In the next part of the what we call the battered women's movement or the history, we decided that we needed to go farther, right? It wasn't enough just to provide safe homes or hotlines for victims to call. We needed to get some laws on the books and some protections on the books at the systemic level that would provide relief from abuse or help victims of abuse. So that's where the PFA Act comes in that you heard about last night. There were all sorts of other programs instituted where law enforcement officers were expected to make arrests in domestic violence cases, which hadn't been happening. Sentencing for offenders or accountability for offenders became very much more important. Why not place the responsibility where it belongs? And also, if victims managed to leave and then had to get involved in the divorce, child custody process, all kinds of other issues around domestic violence are coming up at that point. So protection for mostly women in those cases. Laws to restrict the availability of guns. That's still something, obviously, that we're struggling with as a society and that I think is going in the wrong direction. And in fact, there was just a decision that was made that could put victims of domestic violence at greater risk with their abusers being allowed to have guns. So we're still fighting the good fight. It's not over yet, but we've made progress. And we continued to make progress. We continued to ask systems to be accountable, the child welfare system, law enforcement, the courts, the healthcare system, education. You started to see more public awareness campaigns in the 80s and 90s. And the grassroots movement shifted to a level of professionalism and more mainstream approaches. So at domestic violence agencies today, you'll see a grassroots approach, hopefully still by a staff that has a level of professionalism and a level of grassroots advocacy going on there. So the movement continues. It continued moving on in the 1990s. New programs were developed to address the specific and additional barriers faced by women and other victims from underserved populations, women of color, Native women, victims living in rural communities who didn't have as easy access to services, individuals living with disabilities who are victimized at a higher rate, immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ+ victims, male victims, etc. So broadening that focus and that scope to anyone experiencing domestic violence in any type of relationship. And then finally, more recently, the empowerment approach was sort of reframed into a trauma-informed approach in terms of serving victims of domestic violence as survivors of trauma as well. So what's happening today? Well, a lot of what made all of this possible was federal funding and other funding that was dedicated to domestic violence services and domestic violence programs. These are some of the major ones: the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, that's still a major part of our funding today, passed down through the coalition. The Violence Against Women Act, which was actually President Biden was involved with from the start, was reauthorized year after year. Lately, there's been some foot dragging on that, but it's been reauthorized again. It provides funding for a lot of the specific grant programs that we're able to increase services at local and state programs. We have a county stop program here that is funded by the Violence Against Women Act. We have a transitional housing program that's funded by the Violence Against Women Act. So there are opportunities for states and local communities to be plugged into that funding as well. And then finally, the Victims of Crime Act, which is administered by state organizations, funds services for victims of all crimes, and that's one of our major funders as well. So as the funding increased, the capacity to deliver services increased. The PCADV, or the Pennsylvania Coalition today, has 60 programs that serve all 67 counties. Some rural programs might serve more than one county. They say that we as a collective serve over 90,000 individuals each year in the state of Pennsylvania. They have some priorities as well. Their base is located in Harrisburg, so they work on legislation and public policy at the state level to advance protections for victims of domestic violence. And they have some other specific grant programs like medical advocacy, legal representation that address the needs that victims and survivors face. I'm going to keep moving because of time, but there's always an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what the coalition does. They're our sort of major governing body. Their advocacy model is around, they call it JARS. It revolves around justice, autonomy, restoration, and safety for victims as our goals. So we look at everything we do and put it through that sort of lens and ask ourselves if it contributes in one of those areas for survivors. And you'll dig deeper into all of these topics at a future session. Again, the Victims of Crime Act, established in 1984, that's one of our major sources of funding. Funds services for crime victims. The Sexual Assault Prevention and Crisis Center in Lancaster also receives VOCA funding. They're serving victims of crime as well. So that VOCA funding is really critical to the work that we do. So a short history of DVS and the services we provide. This is going to be the speedy version, but hopefully we might have time for a question or two at the end if you have them. DVS has always been part of the Community Action Partnership of Lancaster. Not all domestic violence programs are part of a larger organization, but some are, many are. SAPC is part of the YWCA, and DVS is part of CAP. So that's the model that's here in Lancaster County. Within CAP, we're part of what's called the Purple Team, which is safety and empowerment. We were originally called the Lancaster Shelter for Abused Women. That was back in 1977 or so when the program started, through about 1989 or in that area when we changed our name to DVS. We are the designated domestic violence program by the state to serve all victims and survivors of domestic violence in the county. You can imagine the county is quite large, so it's quite challenging. Some of you are from Lidditz, Mount Joy. You know, it's quite challenging to cover a county the size of Lancaster. So that's where volunteers can also come in handy in terms of us being out in those communities and, you know, emphasizing that our services aren't just provided in Lancaster City or for folks who live in Lancaster City. We're a delegate and a program of the PCADV, or the Pennsylvania Coalition. They provide our standards, some of our funding. They monitor us. All of that oversight is provided to us, and that makes the programs across the state kind of uniform in certain ways, although they're unique to their counties. All of our services are free and strictly confidential. And if you were on the session last night, you learned just how strict that confidentiality is. And our services are free of charge. Currently, we have 20 full-time and 16 part-time staff. 10 are part-time on a regular schedule, and 6 are what we call substitute staff. They rotate in and out and cover, we're 24/7 operation. So they rotate in and out when other staff are on vacation, sick, and cover those shifts. Those are critical. We were down to 1 substitute staff person, and now we're back up to 6. So feeling much better about that, but they fill in those critical shifts, sometimes on holidays, things like that. And we have 3 sites. We have the Safe House, or the emergency shelter, where most of our offices are located. We have Bridge House, which is a 10-unit transitional housing facility. And we have the Legal Center, which is located near the courthouse. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about those in a few minutes. This is our current mission statement. DVS is a catalyst to end domestic violence in Lancaster County through direct service, advocacy, and social change. We adopted this in 2019. We're currently working on a revision to our mission statement. It doesn't stray far from this original one, though. This pretty much spells out what we do, who we do it for, and where we do it. These are our values. We also have values with CAP, and most of them overlap. But these are the values that we developed back in 2019. This is an organizational chart that shows you sort of the structure of our organization right now. When I brought it over from the format it was in, it didn't quite come over nicely, but it's a fairly clean copy. It just gives you a sense of how we're structured with CAP and the finance, board of directors, and executive team at the top. We have a vice president at CAP that we work with very closely. We don't have our own board of directors, but we have an advisory committee that serves as DVS's board that's specific to DVS. So that might be something that volunteers would be interested in as well, is being part of our advisory committee. And then you see sort of all of our positions and the way that they're mapped out on this organizational chart. And I'll talk a little bit about our departments as we go forward. This is just a sort of graphic map of how we're funded. We are primarily funded through state and federal grants. some local foundations and local grants, and then also through private fundraising and donations. It's always a goal of ours to increase the amount of our funding that is private through fundraising and donations, because those are the funds that are unrestricted and we can do whatever we need to do with them. Most of our other grants have parameters around them, but they're flexible enough that we can do some of our own program design and decide what's best for our community in terms of how we use that funding for victims and survivors. Our largest expense by far is staffing. Our budget is about somewhere between $2.4 and $2.6 million at this point. It's grown over the last 5 years as new sources came on board. But by far, most of our funding goes for staff, salaries, benefits, supporting staff. And then also we own 2 of our facilities. So we're operating 2 facilities, and that's another large place where our funding goes. We are in the midst of working on becoming a trauma-informed organization by engaging with the Klingberg Family Centers and the Traumatic Stress Institute. This is an 18 to 24-month process that involves extensive training, reflection, a task force or work group that operates within our organization to implement a plan that we made to become a trauma-informed organization. There's an evaluation component to that plan so that we can track our progress. And this particular model, like many other trauma-informed models, focuses on the neurobiology of trauma, the adverse childhood experiences study, and what we have learned from that and from more current updates to it, and then normalizing trauma reactions as the expected outcome of what the folks that we're working with have experienced. So this is a really important initiative for our organization, and we've been working really, really hard at this. This initiative seeks to support us to form what we call rich relationships with our clients and with survivors. And this is what the RICH stands for. And you'll dive much deeper into this at a later session as well. Respect. So these relationships we have with survivors are based on respect. Information, the information that we're able to share, and also the information that they share with us. The connection that we make with them, and the sense of hope that we can get from having this, traveling this journey together and helping survivors of trauma heal from their trauma. So there'll be much more about this. This is airplane level stuff. We're also working on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We have a large housing initiative at this point where we're working on trying to find safe, affordable, permanent housing for survivors in Lancaster County, which is a tremendous challenge, as you can imagine. And always working on outreach to underserved and culturally specific populations, including some partnerships with organizations like Church World Service, the LGBTQ+ Center, and lots of other initiatives that you'll hear about as we go along. A brief overview of our services, and you're going to hear a lot more about them as you go along. Emergency services include a 24-hour hotline and text line. We instituted the text line during COVID. Most of us text more than we talk, so it made sense to do that. Emergency housing, which is called emergency shelter, or for us, safe house, for families fleeing domestic violence or currently in domestic violence situations where their safety is at risk. We have a relocation program. Sometimes survivors need to literally relocate to another area or another county for safety, which we can assist them in doing and provide resources for them to do. Or it could be relocating from where they currently are or from our shelter to their own permanent housing. So we have a couple of programs that are working on that. We also have a pet program. Many, if not most, survivors and families coming into shelter have pets that they're concerned about. They're concerned for their pet safety. They don't know what they'll do if they have to leave their pets behind. Sometimes this means that families may stay where they are because they're not able to bring their pets. So we have a program run by some of our staff members where pets can be fostered because we can't at this point have them in our shelter, but pets can be fostered. Their vet care can be taken care of, their vet care brought up to date, etc. Pets as treasured and important members of the family. As a person who have pets, that's of course what I believe and probably what all of you believe as well. So that's really important in a program that we're looking to expand through partnerships with rescues, veterinary clinics, etc. We're on the road for that as well. Supportive services include counseling, not therapy, short-term solution-focused, trauma-informed empowerment counseling, support groups, and domestic violence education, both for residents and community clients. We have an extremely robust children's program in our safe house that we're expanding to our bridge house and to the community. And I think it was you, Kathy, who talked about helping children with experiencing emotions and with emotional regulation. The whole time you were talking about that, I thought that is what our children's program is all about. So we have that program that is very important to us and that we're working to expand. And then we also, of course, perform individual advocacy for our residents and clients and make referrals to hundreds of other community organizations as well and other resources. We've been expanding our housing program. That's one reason that our budget has expanded over the past few years. We own Bridge House, which is a 10-unit apartment building on the other side of the city from the Safe House. And there we have 10 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments where survivors can live for up to usually the range is anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, sometimes a little bit longer. Most often, victims and survivors from the Safe House make the transition to Bridge House. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's most often how it happens. And then the services that are available continue as the individual is at the Bridge House. So basic needs, case management or coaching, counseling and support groups, connection to job training services. All of these things are happening both in the Safe House and the Bridge House as part of someone being in the program with us. Finally, with housing, we are expanding to some HUD-funded housing programs. We're hoping that this will help more survivors get into safe and affordable permanent housing. So you'll be hearing more about this, but an emergency housing to rapid rehousing program. Rapid rehousing, that's basically a program where the survivor moves into their own apartment and a portion of their rent is subsidized for a period of time until they're able to sort of build the capacity to be able to handle the entire rent. That's just a very basic explanation of how that works. And then we're going to have a representative who's part of the 211 system or the coordinated entry system in the county, just so that we're connected there and we're able to do our own 211 assessments and perhaps not have to send survivors elsewhere to have them for safety reasons and for convenience reasons. So it's complex, but you'll hear more about these programs as we go along as well. The Legal Center serves over 1,300 clients per year. I think this year they're on track to serve closer to 1,400 clients. Most of their work revolves around the protection from abuse order, which is a session that you'll have in detail coming up pretty soon. So we provide advocates and attorneys who assist clients for free in that protection from abuse order system, from accompaniment to representation. This is a daunting process for survivors. You'll hear just how daunting it is to seek a PFA and to go through that process. So it's critical that we provide that support and that free representation at those hearings. And then we're fortunate that we have one full-time attorney and soon to be two who will be able to provide representation in custody, child support, divorce cases. You know, for survivors, getting the PFA might be the first step, but then there are other legal needs that they will have that are related to the domestic violence. And we're trying to position our legal clinic so that we're able to cover most of those needs and then make referrals out also to Mid-Penn Legal Center and other attorneys who are willing to help. Angela's department is the education and outreach department. This is a large bucket where many things fall. Community education and prevention programming. A newer project is the medical systems advocacy. So we want to work with the local health systems, community health centers to be able to screen and identify and refer survivors of domestic violence to the appropriate resources and to respond in the appropriate way. We also need to look for connections in the mental health area and behavioral health for survivors. Angela's department oversees this 45-hour advocate training, which is no simple feat. And also a lot of professional trainings, awareness events, domestic violence awareness month, community outreach, and last but certainly not least, volunteer and internship programs. So there's a lot going on in Angela's department as well. We all do systems advocacy in our various areas. This is trying to influence change, break down the structural barriers that victims and survivors of domestic violence have to achieving safety and autonomy on their own terms. So think of all the systems that we work with: the courts, law enforcement, the child protective system, the healthcare system, education. I mean, we could go on and on, all of them, and they all touch survivors' lives. So we're out there advocating for survivors as a whole in those systems as well. So that's a lot, but I did it. We still have a few minutes. I wasn't able to go into a lot of detail about anything, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them or let you know that this is something that you're going to be learning more about at a future session. We can open the floor if you have any questions. Questions, comments, observations. Anyone?
We have Melissa in the chat. Tina Lecht is so glad you're coming to speak to the group next week. We appreciate you all. Is that you, Christine? Or is that Nancy maybe?
I'm not sure, but somebody, that's good.
You did awesome. Thank you for
Awesome.
the background. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of information. And so this is like big picture, everybody. We're going to start to fill in some of the blanks and, you know, we do as best we can try and connect each session's content back to the overall structure and the big picture, but it's important to see where we've come from and some ideas about where we might be going for DVS more specifically, some of the vision that we have. Take a look at some of the documents that were attached to the calendar entry. There's the who we are and what we do sort of thing in there. And so that helps to fill in some of those blanks. There is a video link in there. The DVS 40-year anniversary was in there. So you get a sense of you know, where we were almost 10 years ago, 7 years ago.
7 years ago. Yeah, we have a 50th a 50th coming up. So big,
Looming around
maybe
the
we'll get a
corner.
new video. That'd be great.
And we'll continue to talk about, you know, internship and volunteer opportunities for folks. Really, as I've said in many of the emails and other communications, volunteers and interns work alongside staff in pretty much every capacity. So, you know, we all have the same training, and that's what makes this work. So thank you so much for committing to that.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you have any questions between now and next week, please don't hesitate to email me or text me. I'll have my information. We're going to move to the Tuesday, Wednesday rotation starting next week and for the 4 more weeks. Yeah, just let me know if you need anything. I think most of you are starting to get acclimated to the online learning center. But if you're having any trouble, let me know. So far, I've been able to problem shoot most of it. It's a little bit of a moving target these days, but I think we got it. So
I only have one question.
yeah.
Should we be taking the trainings in order, the ones on the link that you send us?
So what I would do at this point is if you're figuring out like how to prioritize your time and organize those online learning modules, I would go with what applies to the topic for the sessions that are coming up next week. So take a look at those calendar entries or the schedule that I sent and, you know, see what's there. I think the DV 101 has quite a bit because there's just a lot of some general information there. You know, so that's, if I were going to do this again, that's probably what I would do, is just start working those in. And if nothing else, at least show up for the live sessions and then circle back to the online learning modules as you have time and as we get through these. So
okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciated it. It's my privilege to get to meet all of you and get to know you a little bit. I'll see you again at some point, I think, during this process. So I'm really glad that you get to meet the other folks from DVS as well. So thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a great evening and we'll see you next time.
You as well.